It's early spring, 312 AD, in the far northwest of the Italian peninsula. The Cottian Alps glow in the sunny dawn as the busy town of Segusio comes to life. The sentries on the walls have no way of knowing that they are about to witness the first step of a military campaign that will change the world. An army materializes out of the splendid morning light, coming from the mountain passes west of the town. At its head rides the impressive figure of Flavius Valerius Constantius, known to us as Constantine the Great. His arrival will alter history in a manner inconceivable to even the most prominent of astrologists and soothsayers. The sight of his army takes the local militia and the few regulars of the town's garrison by surprise. They are sworn to Emperor Maxentius, one of the 4 Tetrarchs. It was thought that Constantine would spend the campaigning season subduing the tribes of the Rhine. Instead, he is here. The lines of Constantine's iron-faced veterans finally form up in front of Segusio. When the order to open the gates is refused, the onslaught begins. Darts and javelins pick off the men on the walls. Arrows and slingshot put pressure on the towers as the heavy infantry closes in on the walls. The militiamen are stunned by the ferociously quick advance. Ladders go up, and before long, Constantine's men push their way over the parapet. Howls of agony are heard as the legionaries cut their way into the town in a machine-like manner. While the town's defenders are still in the midst of reorganization, a specialist detachment has set the town's gates on fire. Segusio falls in short order, and Constantine's bid for Rome and supremacy has begun. Constantine's chilling descent from the Alps into Italy put Maxentius's already strained situation into a full crisis. Originally elevated by the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome and wider Italy to halt the introduction of imperial taxes and the disbursement of the city's garrison to the war-torn provinces, Maxentius had promoted himself as the champion of the Eternal City and its ancient people. Unlike previous emperors such as the recently deceased Diocletian, who only stepped foot in the city in the 20th year of his reign, Maxentian would make the greatness of Rome the focus of his rule, and it won him great popularity. With the African provinces of Carthage also coming under his remit and providing grain, he was at first able to discharge large remittances and begin grand building projects in the city once more. When the legitimate rulers of the Tetrarchy system he had upended advanced to bring him to heel, first Flavius Valerius Severus and then later Galerius Flavius Maximinus, Maxentius offered bribes and the promise of his new Italian-centric order, skillfully manipulating their soldiers to desert to his side in droves. This policy, along with the sheer size of the city of Rome itself and the difficulty of investing it, made Maxentius's seizure of power a fait accompli. In the same year that Maxentius appointed himself as ruler of the Italian portions of the empire, Constantine broke with Diocletian's tetrarchic order and was acclaimed Augustus by his soldiers at Eboracum in Roman Britain. Making his way across the Channel and into Gaul, he established a base at Triae and then engaged the marauding Franks with success in the winter. Maxentius and Constantine were thus both sons of emperors, and both rebelled after they were passed over for promotion to the Tetrarchy. Maxentius on the retirement of his father Maximian, and Constantine after the death of his father Constantius, while on campaign in Britain. This effectively collapsed the tetrarchic system, and over the course of the next half-decade, there was much fighting and jockeying for position. At one point, the empire had no fewer than 7 rulers, all of them claiming some kind of legitimacy from the original formation instituted by Diocletian. By 312, this had been reduced to 4, Constantine in the west, with Britain, Gaul and Spain pledging loyalty to him. Maximian Daza in the east, controlling Anatolia, Syria and Egypt. Licinius, who controlled the Pannonian, Illyrian and Greek provinces up to the Bosphorus. And Maxentius in Italy and North Africa. But Maxentius was finding that the original premise of his elevation was wearing thin. Not only was Italy and Rome now cut off from the income provided by the provinces, but revolts in Africa also endangered the grain supply, meaning that Maxentius was forced to institute the very taxes and conscription that he had pledged to block at the outset of his coup. The policies worked, and Maxentius was able to retake Africa, securing the grain and also heavily plundering the rebel areas. This action sent a strong message to the other 3 Augusti. Maxentius had a large, capable army, possibly 100,000 strong, and his adroit command structure, logistical capacity and strategic prowess had been made manifestly evident in the transcontinental operation. Though he had lost the support of his people, his army remained loyal, at least for the time being. Convinced that Constantine was intending to campaign once more against the Franks in 312, he had sent his general, Praetorian prefect Ruricius Pompeianus, to the east approaches to block an expected attack from Licinius. Pompeianus was likely in Verona when Constantine arrived in Italy and invested Segusio, and there was another strong Maxentian force at Aquileia. Maxentius was in Rome, apparently due to a portent that the city would fall, and he would die were he to leave it. Nevertheless, his armies in the northeast swiftly set off to interrupt and engage the invading army of Constantine. With the small garrison and local militia of Segusio defeated, and the city in his hands, Constantine went against expectations again and pardoned the population and their leaders. He ordered his army to put out the fires that had started as a result of their burning the city gates, and the gratitude of the populace was such that the town immediately pledged itself to him. This was a notable action by Constantine, as the city had refused to surrender when he initially offered it terms. He was, however, focused on playing the role of liberator and ultimately becoming Augustus of a reunited empire, so his campaign was conducted with a significant amount of restraint. With Segusio thus secure, Constantine's army moved on to Augusta Taurinorum, modern Turin. There, he skillfully enveloped and dispatched another professional Maxentian army. Chasing them through the Po Valley, Constantine outfitted his troops with iron-covered clubs, which proved deadly against Maxentian's armored cavalry. After this action, Constantine occupied Mediolanum without a contest, and from there moved east to besiege Verona. Pompeianus attempted to wear down and stall Constantine's army with another cavalry attack, but this was also broken at Brixia, Constantine fighting in his usual place at the front line, and likely using the same envelopment tactics he had at Augusta Taurinorum. Working on videos is a dream job for me, and I'm grateful I can share them with all of you. The one downside is working long hours and the burnout that comes with it, all the while caring for my ill father. All of this can become a bit overwhelming at times, and it can affect my sleep patterns and eating habits, and I avoid social interactions more than usual. But of course, while we all face challenges in life, it's important to recognize when we might need some extra support. That's where BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's video, comes in. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site, answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. You can do it all from your phone or computer via phone call, video chat, or messaging, however you feel most comfortable. It's the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/historymarsh or choose HistoryMarsh during sign-up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. By the late spring or early summer, Constantine was at the walls of Verona, the base of Maxentius's forces in northern Italy. Pompeianus was inside the city, and for the first time in the campaign, Constantine was facing a commander of elite ability. Both men attempted to force the matter to a head. First, Constantine cut off the city's supplies by investing it from the south and taking the opposite bank of the river Athasis, which surrounded the settlement on the remaining 3 sides. He was unable to force his way through the formidable defences of Verona, however, and Pompeianus felt assured enough to lead an assault at his main lines. This failed, and Pompeianus next escaped through Constantine's blockade and made his way to Aquileia for reinforcements. Constantine was still incapable of overpowering the veterans inside Verona, and when Pompeianus returned, leading another strong army, Constantine found himself in a similar position to Julius Caesar at Alesia. With no time or means to construct a second line of defense works, as the dictator had in his battle with Vercingetorix, Constantine channeled the spirit of his forebear and led a portion of his force in a final battle, inspiring his men in the front line. Pompeianus likewise seemed to have fought from the front, leading his men in laying about the besieging force, but it was Constantine's day. Pompeianus had come onto Constantine's forces while the sun was setting, and the fighting lasted until well into the dark. The Maxentian forces only gave way when Pompeianus himself was killed in the thick of the lines. Constantine sent a new call for surrender to the garrison inside the city, which they accepted after losing their talismanic leader. Aquileia then seems to have gone over to Constantine's side in the wake of the carnage at Verona, and with his numbers likely raised again by defectors from the remainder of Maxentius's northern forces, Constantine set off on the Via Flamina for Rome. From Ariminum on the east coast, he proceeded to Fanum Fortunae, before making the abrupt turn across the Apennines and threading the Furlow Pass, and moving on to the Scheggia. There does not seem to have been any serious attempt by Maxentius to halt Constantine at these choke points, but it is possible that the forces stationed at Spoletium and Ocriculum gave the advancing army a hard fight to pass through their elevated environs. Both towns feature long slopes that would have made any advancing army an open target while it was proceeding upward, and the exchange of missiles before the inevitable crunch of the infantry battle would have been a searing, torturous crucible. Constantine's army continued toward Rome, but Maxentius's Moorish North African cavalry and lanciarii, specialist mounted personnel with the javelin, harassed his columns and flanks. 9 miles from Rome, at Saxa Rubra, the personal forces of Maxentius and Constantine had their first major altercation, when Maxentian units likely used the volcanic rock ridges and bluffs of the area to initiate an ambush on Constantine's vanguard. Little detail is known about this action, except that Maxentius's forces seem to have had significant success, likely lacerating Constantine's vanguard and either forcing their retreat to the main body of the army, or else compelling the main body to come forward and suffer losses in extricating their comrades from the Maxentian attacks. Constantine's host remained mostly intact following the battle, but Maxentius had scored a significant blow. Both sides now regrouped, and the leaders deliberated their next actions. Maxentius had gained his first victory since Constantine arrived in Italy more than 6 months earlier, but the city and its hundreds of thousands of people were still highly restive, and the magnetism and persuasive character that had seen Maxentius through all of the tribulation of the previous 6 years perhaps seemed a spent force. At games held to celebrate the 6th anniversary of his accession, the people cried out to Maxentius that Constantine could not be defeated and that he had to face him. The threat of losing the support of the mob was very real, and there had already been instances of fighting between his praetorians and the citizens. But Maxentius's forces in Rome still remained loyal, and their confidence had undoubtedly been boosted by the events at Saxa Rubra. In a grand gesture, perhaps to instill further belief in his ranks, he publicly consulted the ancient Sibylline books, the prophetic volumes sold to the last king of Rome more than 8 centuries earlier. Maxentius announced that the prophecies told him that an enemy of Rome would perish in battle, and he also chose the very day of his accession, the 28th of October, as the date on which he would eradicate Constantine. As the self-appointed champion of the city, Maxentius said it stood to reason that Constantine was the enemy the Sibyl was referring to in the books. These were auspicious tidings, but it was most likely that Maxentius felt that the city would not stand against a prolonged siege, and assassination was too realistic a possibility to remain inside it. Although contemporary sources state that the city was provisioned for an unlimited time, it's almost certain that the African revolt had affected his reserves, and Constantine's forces were unlikely to defect, as Severus's and Galerius's legions had when they made their respective attempts to take Rome. Constantine was every bit as circumspect as Maxentius in keeping his army satisfied with their conditions. Throughout his reign, he had endeavoured to either keep them on campaign where they would avail of plunder and awards, or made sure that they were paid all salaries and attendant service bonuses. But after the shock of defeat at Saxa Rubra, Constantine needed some further motivation for his legions to overcome their last and greatest hurdle, and it came in the form of divine inspiration. Encamped north of Rome, his biographers Lactantius and Eusebius relate that Constantine underwent a transformative experience in which he, and possibly his men, saw a phenomenon in the sky that formed a solar symbol similar to a Christian cross. Constantine's dreams later that night elaborated on this vision, and when he awoke the next morning, he gave orders for his men to emblazon their shields with the Chi-Rho symbol of Christ. Whether it was a genuine spiritual event for Constantine or an obvious evolution of his existing monotheism with the sun god, the spectacular blessings of heaven on the campaign reinvigorated his ranks and filled them with spirit for the looming collision. Thus it was, with Constantine galvanized by the vision of the Christian God and Maxentius by the ancient prophecies of the Sibyl, the two armies met on a bend in the Tiber, just north of the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius sent his army along the Via Flaminia toward the Tiber River, its water swollen by autumn rains. Some units crossed the Tiber via the Milvian Bridge, and others employed an improvised pontoon bridge of boats just upstream. Awaiting Constantine, they set up camp on the northern and southern banks of the river, and the North Bank units took control of the southern edge of the plain, now known as the Tor de Quinto. Maxentius had chosen this plain as the site for the coming battle. With their left flank covered by steep bluffs and their rear and right by the meander of the Tiber, there would be no room for either side to conduct complex tactics. This was to nullify the tactical genius of the formidable Constantine, known for his adeptness in envelopment tactics. Constantine's army approached the northern edge of the plain, harassed on its march by Moorish cavalry and mounted lancieri. Constantine's army was a crack force of veterans, consisting of legionary detachments from the Rhine and Britain, as well as guardsmen and cavalry. They had fought multiple campaigns in Britain and the Rhineland under Constantine and his father before him, and their victories in northern Italy had added further to their experience and morale. Constantine had also levied units from defeated barbarian tribes, including Germans and possibly Picts. A panegyric to Constantine notes that his army had fewer than 40,000 men when it first arrived in Italy, from a total of perhaps 160,000 under Constantine's command in Britain, Gaul, Germania, and Iberia. He was limited in this way, as he could only bring so many soldiers without compromising the Rhine and British frontiers. Furthermore, his army had undergone attrition through casualties and the possible need to garrison cities, so it is likely that he had between 30 and 35,000 men by the time he descended onto the Tor de Quinto, its grasses, oleander and laurel trees, a more vibrant green than usual in the autumn, mixed with the caramel brown of the soil. The Maxentian army included the Praetorian Guard and the Imperial Horse Guard. These units were traditionally based in Rome and had been by Maxentius's side from the beginning. Also present were the thousands of veterans of Severus and Galerius who had defected to Maxentius during their attempts to unseat him, including various legionary units and the elite Moorish cavalry of Severus. In addition, Maxentius had recruited large numbers of Italians, Sicilians, and North Africans as legionaries. Many of the latter units appear to have been untried and under-trained levies. However, the veterans of Severus and Galerius had served in campaigns during the Tetrarchy of Diocletian, and under Maxentius they had seen further action against the African usurpation and Licinius. Saxa Rubra had given a glimmer of hope that Constantine's forces were indeed beatable, but any Maxentian officer who knew their history would have been aware that border legions, used to aggressive offensive action against lethal and numerous enemies, almost invariably bested Italian-based units and the Praetorians, whose duties were almost entirely limited to garrison and public order duties. From its 100,000-strong size at the advent of the campaign, it is likely that Maxentius's army was similar in numbers to that of Constantine prior to the Milvian Bridge. He may have had a modest numerical advantage, enough to justify fighting a battle using less experienced conscripts, but he probably had between 35 and 40,000 troops under his command. Maxentius's army allowed Constantine's men to array themselves in the plain, and both sides prepared for an existential clash. The composition of both armies were also indicative of the changes within the Roman army that had begun under Diocletian and would continue until the collapse of the Western administration in the next century. Most noticeably, cavalry had a far more prominent role and comprised a greater proportion of the total units than in that of the classical legions, with the ally auxiliary units that had long dominated mounted support being sent entirely to the border, and vexellations, regular cavalry that were equal in rank to the legionaries, replacing them. Constantine himself commanded the Klebenarii, super-heavy cavalry that were the embryonic form of the medieval cataphract, and used to tear gaping holes in enemy lines and allow the infantry to take advantage in their wake. Other noticeable differences would have been the mixture of different legionary standards across both sides of the battlefield. In contrast to earlier centuries, most of the new legions formed under Diocletian were smaller than the classical legion, but those that were still in the order of 5,000 to 6,000 men did not campaign with their full complement of legionaries. Instead, perhaps only a third of their members went on campaign, while the remainder attended to garrison duties or operations in another area. At the same time, the non-Roman elements that would, in the coming decades, begin to dominate the legionary ranks were also already becoming significant in Constantine's army. The Alemannic king Crocus had been prominent when Constantine was proclaimed Augustus at Eboracum, and he and his warriors were likely also present at the Milvian Bridge, in addition to other Germans and the Picts. As the two forces faced one another, each seeing the personal standards of their respective emperors for the first time, the meander of the Tiber around both armies ensured that if either side routed, the options for retreat would be limited. Maxentius and the units on the south bank crossed the bridges to join the rest of the army and then destroyed the pontoon bridge. The boats forming the bridge would have foundered and knocked into one another, floating until they came to an uneven stop at another point in the churning river. Only the Milvian Bridge was left standing. Maxentius cut the bridge of boats to encourage a fight-or-die mentality among his soldiers. With limited space available, Constantine likely formed his infantry into a double-line formation, a duplex arches. With even less space to maneuver, Maxentius's infantry appear to have formed an agmen quadratum, a deep rectangular defensive formation that would help them to cope with the attacks of Constantine's veterans. The Italian and African levies likely took up position as reserves in the formation's rear, whereas the Praetorians and legionary veterans formed the front line. The formation was protected on its left by steep hills, and on its right by Maxentius himself, who took up position with part of his cavalry. These horsemen consisted of at least 2 divisions, with Maxentius and the Imperial Horse Guard forming part of a second or reserve division behind the vanguard. To their front were Constantine's best cavalry, led by Constantine himself. Both armies likely also had cavalry on their other flanks and skirmishers to their front. As the two armies approached one another, Constantine initiated hostilities, leading his cavalry against the Maxentian right-wing horsemen. Meanwhile, Constantine's generals ordered the infantry to advance against the agmen quadratum. The experienced Constantinian mounted units propelled into the enemy with such ferocity that they quickly overwhelmed the Maxentian mounted vanguard and caused them to rout. Lacking space, the fleeing cavalry charged through their own men, causing disarray among the infantry and the 2nd Division of Cavalry. Not long after, the infantry lines clashed, and a fearsome battle ensued along the front lines. This was the point where the battle would be won or lost. Neither side could afford to retreat. Despite the heat of exertion and armor, the injuries, and the agonizing attacks from the men across from them. In the confined space of the battlefield, veterans on both sides hacked at one another with spear and sword, and hurled their pila to wound or kill. The rear ranks threw lance, a kind of light javelin, and a plume bataille, lead-weighted darts, as well as shooting arrows. These plume bataille were tipped with razor barbs on top of a short, hand-length metal shaft, under which was placed a lead weight. At just under half a pound, they could be flung towards the enemy, either embedding themselves into a shield and weighing it down, or else puncturing flesh and embedding to a depth of about 3 inches, scraping and splintering bone. Maxentius's Praetorians fought with special vigor. They were among Maxentius's closest supporters and beneficiaries. They also did not expect to receive mercy from Constantine, being greatly responsible for the usurpation of domains that had been in the possession of his father, Constantius. With the contest still in question and Maxentius's force holding for the moment, Constantine's cavalry division halted to regroup and recuperate, but Maxentius and his second division of horsemen soon emerged before the Constantinians and bore down upon them. Maxentius hoped to use fresh troops against an exhausted enemy, but the Constantinians were not so easily overcome. They were a disciplined unit and had defeated the vanguard too quickly to fully exhaust themselves. Moreover, the flight of the vanguard through the ranks of their own comrades had caused a delay while Maxentius formed the counterattack. The horse guard charged, their iron hooves thrumming so loudly over the soft earth that they eclipsed the noise of the still ferocious infantry battle. The moment of contact was colossal, the energy of the lances striking armor reverberating across the plain like a shockwave. For an instant, everything hung in the balance. More and more men of both armies lost sight for all else except for their own survival and the slaughter of their enemy. But Constantine's cavalry held firm, and a bitter fight took place beside the fast-flowing waters of the Tiber. So long as Maxentius's second division also held its line, there was stalemate, a grinding attrition that wore away at the ranks like flaking paint. As with the Praetorians, the Imperial Horse Guard had been loyal to Maxentius from the beginning. However, led by their divinely inspired emperor, Constantine's cavalry would not be denied the victory that had been promised, and slowly but surely they gained the upper hand. Finally, perhaps with the fall of a single cavalryman or the turn of a horse, Maxentius's second division routed, and Maxentius fled with them. His army quickly unraveled. Seeing their right flank exposed, Maxentius's raw levies also fled from the fight, abandoning the veterans to their front. Some of Constantine's cavalry remained on the heels of Maxentius, while others attacked his frontline infantry in the flanks and rear. Blood was in the water, and they could sense the release of victory. Maxentius's veteran infantry was now fighting a losing battle, but the Praetorians in particular refused to flee. As their green legionaries broke and fled, the Praetorians found themselves surrounded on all sides. Behind, the fugitives fled for the Milvian Bridge. It became a bottleneck, and many escaping soldiers tried to wade or swim across. Scores, hundreds, and finally thousands drowned in the churning waters. Other soldiers attempted to crowd onto the narrow Milvian Bridge, pushing one another into the Tiber as they attempted to make it to the other side. With Constantine finally catching up to them, those caught on the north bank of the Tiber were summarily massacred. As for Maxentius, he attempted to ford the Tiber on horseback before being overcome by its strong current and swollen waters. Covered in heavy armor, the Tetrarch drowned in the Tiber's waters, along with many of the other fugitives. Meanwhile, the Praetorians fought on, falling where they stood, until finally Constantine offered them the opportunity to surrender. Perhaps surprised and relieved, the Praetorians accepted the offer. Losses for either army are not well documented, but it is certain that Maxentius's army suffered very high casualties. Constantine had won Rome, the greatest city in the world and the lawful and spiritual home of the empire, until he decided to construct his new capital at Byzantium in the coming decades. By the next day, the Tiber's current had slowed, the river being clogged with corpses. Maxentius's body was held in place by obstructions, perhaps others who had drowned. Recognizable by its distinctive armor, his corpse was fished out of the river and beheaded. Constantine entered the city in triumph, the Cairo of Christ prominently displayed for the first time by any emperor. Next to the cross, Maxentius's head was paraded through the streets on a spear. Constantine once more presented himself as a liberator, and so the city's inhabitants played their part, hurling abuse at Maxentius to please their new imperator. Maxentius's old collaborators, the Senate, declared Constantine Maximus Augustus, and Constantine rededicated Maxentius's construction projects in his own name. In a final move that showed just how thorough his triumph was, Constantine disbanded the imperial horse guards and the Praetorians, redistributing them along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Destroying their fortified camps and desolating their cemeteries, the emperor built churches in their place. In dissolving the Praetorian Guard, the emperor ended a military unit that had existed since the time of Augustus. Constantine's victory gave him control over the entire Western Empire, and soon afterward, in 313, Constantine's ally Licinius overthrew Maximinus Daza in turn, the two men splitting the empire between them for a decade. Constantine would eventually overthrow Licinius, uniting the empire under his sole rule in 324. Most importantly, Constantine's success at the Milvian Bridge confirmed to him that the God of the Christians had guided his victory. From that moment, Constantine would dedicate himself to actively promoting Christianity, a religion that was still being persecuted in many parts of the empire at the time of the battle. Sponsored by the imperial state apparatus, Christianity took hold with far-reaching consequences for the history of the Mediterranean and eventually the entire world.
If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.